You
I
ever
understand
watch
your
something
position, but this
expensive
is the
die
only way it
in
drains
complete
properly.
silence?
But
You're ignoring
The water
procedure,
started
violating
dropping
HOA
before
rules.
anyone even
just have to wait
noticed.
for it to
Just a
finish.
thin
All
spiral
right,
at
you old
first,
thing. Let's see
a
if we can get
quiet
you
pull
moving.
beneath that perfect blue surface, like the pool itself was taking a slow
Finally.
breath out,
There you
and I
go.
stood there with my
The new
boots in the
pool
dirt,
hours will be
hands
posted by
still
the end of
damp
the
from the
week.
valve, tasting chlorine
Okay,
in the
great.
air
That's
mixed
really
with the
helpful.
thick,
Yes, thank you
familiar
for the
smell of
update.
wet soil. And
You
I
told
knew
me I had
exactly
until the
how
end of the
many minutes
week.
it would take, because I'd
The
run the numbers
paperwork
weeks
says
ago.
otherwise.
Long
Get it
before a
done
single
now.
tile was laid, long before Diane Holloway stood on this land with her clipboard and that polished smile, telling everyone this was community improvement. Because
The
what she
measurements
didn't
confirm it's
understand,
exactly as the
what none
plans
of them
specify.
understood,
Yep.
And
was
the
that
structural
water
integrity
doesn't
is
belong
fine.
to whoever builds
All
the
right.
prettiest
Thank
thing
you,
on top of
gentlemen.
it. It belongs to whoever controls where it flows. And right now, it was flowing out fast, faster than their $1 million illusion could handle. The sound shifting from gentle trickle to a hollow gulping echo as the deep end began to expose itself. Pale concrete rising like bones under skin, kids' laughter turning into confused murmurs, someone yelling about the pump, someone else saying it must be a malfunction, but I just watched, steady, breathing slow, the way my grandfather taught me when we used to check the old irrigation gates at dawn, back when this land wasn't surrounded by beige houses and HOA rules printed on glossy paper. Back when the only sound out here was wind moving through dry grass and the low hum of water doing exactly what it was told. And that's the thing about systems like this. They don't care about opinions or meetings or who got elected president of what neighborhood. They respond to pressure, to direction, to control. And 3 months ago when I came back and saw a full-size community pool sitting right in the middle of my property line like it had always been there, I didn't yell, I didn't call the cops. I didn't even step onto the concrete. I just stood there and listened, because underneath all that splashing and music and fake laughter, I could hear it, the steady pull of water being fed from a source they never bothered to question. A source buried under 30 acres of land that's been in my family since 1958, land that still runs on a system designed by a man who believed water was the only thing that truly decided ownership. And as the pool dropped another inch, then another, the surface breaking into uneven ripples, I could feel that old lesson settling back into place, heavy and certain, because Diane thought she built something permanent, something valuable, something she could show off in brochures and open houses. But what she really built was a dependency, and now, with the low sucking sound echoing louder and the deep end already half exposed, that dependency was collapsing right in front of her, and she still hadn't figured out why. I learned to listen to water before I learned to drive, before I learned to sign my own name on a property deed, back when my grandfather would wake me up at 5 in the morning and the air still smelled like cold metal and damp grass, and we would walk the fence line in silence except for the crunch of gravel under our boots and the distant hum of the old pump system pulling from the creek, and he would stop every now and then, tilt his head slightly, and say nothing for a full minute like he was waiting for something invisible to speak. And when I finally asked what he was doing, he just said, "You do not look at land to understand it. You listen to what moves through it." And back then I thought he was just being poetic, some old rancher wisdom that did not mean much in a world full of contracts and permits and surveys. But standing there now watching that waterline sink inch by inch, I could hear exactly what he meant. Because this entire neighborhood, every manicured lawn and every matching mailbox, was built on the assumption that control comes from paperwork, that if you file the right forms and hold the right meetings you can rewrite reality. But water does not read documents. It follows grade, pressure, and access. And all three of those things still belong to me, even if nobody bothered to check. And that was the first thing I noticed the day I came back and saw the pool for the first time. The faint vibration under my boots, a steady pull, running beneath the surface like a quiet engine. And I remember crouching down near the edge, pretending to tie my boot just so I could place my hand against the concrete and feel it, the temperature difference, the subtle movement, the unmistakable sign that they had tapped into the old feed line, without even realizing what it was connected to. And I almost laughed right there because it meant everything they had built depended on something they did not control, something they did not even know existed beyond a line on a map labeled inactive irrigation. And that word inactive is what gave them confidence. Because to people like Diane, if something is not visible, if it is not part of their immediate system, then it does not matter. But she never asked why that line existed in the first place, never asked who installed it, never asked where it led, and more importantly, never asked who still had the ability to open or close it. And that was fine by me, because the less she knew, the deeper she went. And over the next few weeks, I watched them pour more money into it, adding lighting, adding lounge chairs, installing a filtration system that hummed day and night like it was breathing, and every improvement just tightened the dependency, just made the entire structure more fragile in a way they could not see. And every time I drove past and caught the sharp scent of chlorine drifting across land that used to smell like hay and diesel, I could feel that quiet pressure. Building, not anger exactly, something more controlled, more patient, like a valve waiting to be turned at the right moment, because I was not interested in arguing with them. I was not interested in convincing anyone. I was interested in timing. And timing is something you only understand when you grow up watching water move through land that remembers every decision ever made on it. And as the pool behind me let out another deep hollow gulp, exposing another strip of pale concrete to the sun, I realized that everything my grandfather taught me had been leading to this exact moment. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise. Because real control does not announce itself. It waits until everything else depends on it, and then it decides when to stop. By the time Diane Holloway realized something was wrong, the water had already dropped past the shallow end markers, and that polished confidence she carried like perfume started to crack just enough for me to see the panic underneath. Her voice cutting through the air sharp and controlled at first as she barked orders at the maintenance guy, who was already kneeling by the pump housing with his hands hovering like he was afraid to touch anything. The steady mechanical hum that used to fill the space now replaced with a hollow sucking noise that echoed off the emptying walls. And I could see it in his face before he even said a word. That moment when someone understands they are dealing with something outside their system, outside their checklist, outside anything they can fix with a wrench or a quick call to a contractor. And Diane kept talking anyway, talking louder, talking faster, like volume could restore control, demanding answers, demanding explanations, demanding someone tell her how this could happen in a controlled community with regulations and oversight and monthly dues that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of thing. And I stayed where I was, boots planted in the dirt just beyond the concrete edge, the dry grass brushing against my jeans, feeling the warm Texas sun starting to hit the exposed surface of what used to be the deep end. And for a brief second her eyes landed on me, really landed on me for the first time since all of this started, not as the guy who owned the adjacent land, not as a name on some outdated record, but as someone standing completely still while everything she built was quietly coming apart. And she walked over with that same controlled stride, heels clicking against the deck even as the ground beneath her narrative was shifting, and she asked me if I knew anything about what was happening, her tone wrapped in politeness but edged with something sharper, something closer to accusation, and I could smell the chlorine fading now, replaced by the heavier scent of wet concrete and exposed earth. And I took a second before answering, not because I needed time, but because timing matters, even in conversation. And I told her the truth in the simplest way possible, that systems like this do not fail on their own, that something upstream always decides what happens downstream. And she frowned at that, just enough to show she did not like the direction this was going. And she started talking about permits and inspections and certified contractors, listing them off like they were shields that could stop what was already in motion. And I nodded slowly, letting her finish, letting her build that wall of authority she trusted so much, because I knew exactly where it ended, and behind us another section of tile surfaced, the waterline retreating like it was pulling away from her control piece by piece. And somewhere a kid asked why the pool was disappearing, and nobody had a good answer. And that was the moment the illusion started to break, not with a loud crash, not with anything dramatic, but with confusion spreading through a crowd that had always believed everything around them was stable, permanent, guaranteed. And Diane turned back toward the pool, then back to me, and I could see the calculation starting, the realization that this was not random, not accidental, and definitely not something she could manage with a meeting agenda. And for the first time since she stepped onto my land months ago, she did not speak immediately. She just looked, really looked, and I held that gaze without saying another word, because everything that needed to be said was already happening right in front of her, inch by inch, gallon by gallon, exactly the way I planned it. The first time Diane Holloway stepped onto this land, she did not ask a single question, not about the boundary lines, Not about the old irrigation system buried beneath the soil. Not even about why a stretch of property that had been left untouched for years might still matter to someone who understood it differently. She just arrived with surveyors and contractors and a confidence that came from years of getting her way. And I remember watching from the far side of the fence as wooden stakes went into the ground like they were claiming something already decided, the sharp metallic ring of hammers carrying across the field, the smell of fresh-cut lumber mixing with the dry scent of sun-baked dirt. And when I finally walked over, boots sinking slightly into the softer soil near the creek line, she greeted me with that same practiced smile I had already seen her use on neighbors, the kind that feels polite until you realize it never actually asks anything. It only informs. And she told me they were upgrading the community, adding value, improving and used land that had been sitting idle for too long. And I let her talk, let her explain how this would benefit everyone, how it would raise property values, how it would create a shared space for families. All those words stacked neatly like the brochures she would eventually hand out. And when she finished, I asked her one simple thing, whether she had checked the water access, and she paused just long enough to show me she had not, then brushed it off like it was a minor detail, something her contractors would handle, something already accounted for in whatever paperwork she trusted more than the ground beneath her feet. And that was the moment I understood exactly how this was going to play out, not because I wanted it to, but because I had seen this pattern before in smaller ways. People assuming that visible ownership is the same as actual control, people believing that if they can build something solid enough it becomes theirs by default. And I nodded, stepped back, and let them continue, because stopping them right then would have been easy. A phone call, a survey dispute, maybe even a temporary injunction. But easy does not always mean effective, and I needed them to commit, to invest, to build something that depended entirely on a system they did not understand. And over the following weeks I watched the transformation unfold, the steady rhythm of construction replacing the quiet cycles of the land. Concrete poured in smooth gray sheets, tiles laid with precision, pipes installed that connected directly into lines older than anyone on that crew, lines that still carried my family name in county records filed decades before Diane ever thought about becoming president of anything. And every time I drove past and saw the shape taking form, I could hear my grandfather's voice in the back of my mind, not warning me, not telling me to stop them, just reminding me that control is not about what you build, it is about what you can take away. And now, standing here with the pool nearly empty and the last few inches of water clinging to the deepest part like it was trying to hold on to something already gone, I could see that lesson unfolding in real time, because Diane did not lose control all at once. She lost it gradually, quietly, the same way she gained it, one assumption at a time, until there was nothing left for her to stand on but a structure that no longer belonged to her the way she thought it did. By the time the last sheet of water slipped below the drain line, the entire structure felt different, not like a place people gathered, but like something exposed, unfinished, almost temporary, and the silence that followed was heavier than any noise that had filled it before, broken only by the faint drip of water clinging to tile edges and the distant lowing of cattle from the far side of the property. A sound that did not belong to Diane's version of this land, but had always belonged to mine. And she stood there at the edge, arms crossed tighter now, her posture rigid in a way that told me she was still trying to hold on to authority even as the foundation of it drained away. And she started talking again, but this time the words were different, less polished, more pointed, asking who had access to the system, who could have interfered, how something like this could happen without notice. And I could hear the shift, the move from confidence to control-seeking, from presentation to investigation. And I let her go through it. Let her list off possibilities that all stayed comfortably inside her understanding of how things worked: contractors, equipment failure, maintenance oversight, anything that kept the answer within reach of her structure, because the moment she stepped outside that, the moment she considered that control might exist somewhere she did not oversee, everything she built would stop making sense. And I could see the others starting to step back, neighbors who had been lounging just minutes ago now standing with arms folded, glancing between the empty basin and Diane like they were waiting for reassurance that never came. And that is the thing about systems built on perception. They hold as long as people believe in them. But the second doubt enters, even quietly, they start to unravel in ways no rulebook can fix. and I took a few steps forward then, slow, deliberate, boots scraping lightly against the concrete as I moved. From the dirt onto the edge of what used to be the shallow end, feeling the temperature difference underfoot, warm sun hitting exposed surfaces that had not seen daylight since they were installed, and I crouched down again, running my fingers along the inside wall, where a faint line marked the previous water level, a clean divide between what had been submerged and what had not, and I could feel the texture change, slick fading into dry. And behind me Diane asked again, sharper this time, if I knew anything about the water supply, and I finally turned to face her fully, not rushed, not defensive, just steady, and I told her something she should have asked months ago, that every drop that had filled this pool came from a controlled line, and that line did not belong to her association, did not belong to her contractors, did not belong to any permit she filed or any approval she secured. It belonged to the land itself and to the system that had been running long before her neighborhood existed, and I watched that land shift in her eyes as she processed it, watched the calculation change from problem-solving to something closer to realization, and around us the space that used to feel like a centerpiece now felt like an empty shell, and in the distance the cattle moved closer to the fence line, drawn by the scent of fresh water settling into the trough I redirected it toward, and for the first time since this all began, the land felt balanced again, not because something was destroyed, but because something had been corrected, quietly, precisely, exactly the way it was always meant to be. What Diane did next told me everything about the kind of control she thought she still had, because instead of stepping back and asking the right questions, she reached for her phone, fingers tight around it like it was the last tool she trusted, already dialing someone before she even finished processing what I said, her voice low at first, then rising as she stepped a few feet away, talking about permits, liability, unauthorized interference. Words that sounded official but felt hollow in the open air of something she could no longer contain, and I turned away from her for a moment, letting that conversation fade into the background as I walked along the edge of the drained basin, boots echoing slightly against the exposed surface, the faint smell of sun-warmed concrete replacing the sharp bite of chlorine that had dominated this space for weeks, and I could see the full structure now, every slope, every drain, every line they had carefully installed to make this look permanent, and it struck me how much effort had gone into something that depended entirely on a single point of control they never secured, and that is where most people get it wrong. They focus on what is visible, what impresses others, what photographs well, and they forget that systems are not defined by what you see, they are defined by what sustains them, and without that, everything else is just decoration. And as I reached the deep end, now fully exposed and dry except for a thin layer of water collecting near the drain, I could hear the cattle more clearly, the slow rhythmic movement of hooves shifting in dirt as they gathered around the trough I redirected the flow into, a sound steady and grounded, completely indifferent to what had just happened here. And that contrast settled something in me, because this was never about taking something from Diane, it was about restoring something that had been misused, and behind me her voice cut sharper now, frustration breaking through whatever composure she had left as she demanded immediate answers from whoever was on the other end of that call, asking how a system like this could be accessed, how it could be shut off without authorization, and I could almost hear the pause from the person responding, the moment they realized the question itself was flawed, because authorization depends on ownership, and ownership depends on something far older than any HOA document. And she ended the call abruptly, turning back toward me with a different expression now, less polished, more direct, and she asked who exactly had the authority over the water feeding this system. And I did not rush the answer. I let the silence sit for a second, the kind that makes people pay attention, and then I told her plainly that authority did not come from her office, did not come from her board, did not come from any vote or meeting or committee decision. It came from the original infrastructure tied to this land, infrastructure that had been registered, maintained, and legally protected long before her development existed. And as those words settled, I could see it finally connect, not all at once, but enough. Enough for her to understand that this was not an accident, not a malfunction, not something she could escalate through her usual channels, and around us the space felt quieter, not empty, but resolved, like something had shifted back into place after being forced out of alignment. And I took one last look across the basin, the clean lines now stripped of illusion, and then out toward the pasture where the water now served its original purpose, steady, controlled, exactly where it was meant to go, and for the first time since I returned. There was no tension left in the air, just the simple, undeniable reality of who actually controlled what mattered. The shift after that moment was not loud. It did not come with shouting or dramatic gestures. It came with silence, the kind that settles over a place when people realize the rules they thought they understood no longer apply. And I could see it ripple through the small crowd that had gathered. Neighbors who had shown up for a normal afternoon, now standing at the edge of something they could not explain, their conversations dropping into low murmurs, their eyes moving from the empty basin to Diane, and then to me like they were trying to piece together a version of reality that still made sense, and Diane herself stood still for a second longer than she intended. That pause just long enough to betray the fact that she was recalculating, not just the situation but her position in it. Because for someone used to directing outcomes, the loss of immediate control does not feel like defeat at first. It feels like confusion, like a gap in the script that needs to be filled quickly, and she tried. I will give her that. She straightened her posture, adjusted her tone, and began speaking again, this time addressing the group instead of just me, explaining that there had been an unexpected infrastructure issue, that they would be investigating immediately, that everything would be handled through proper channels, and the words sounded familiar, practiced, the same kind of language that had worked for her before, but this time they landed differently, softer, less convincing, because everyone could see what she could not fix in real time. The absence of water, the exposed structure, the simple fact that something essential had been removed and not a single person in her system could restore it. And I stepped back off the concrete then, letting my boots return to the dirt where they belonged, the ground firm and steady underfoot, and I took a slow breath, the air carrying a mix of dry grass and distant water now flowing where it was supposed to. And I did not need to say anything else, not to her, not to anyone, because the demonstration was complete. And that is the difference between arguing and proving. Arguments rely on words, on persuasion, on back and forth, but proof stands on its own, quiet and undeniable. And as I turned slightly, looking out toward the pasture where the trough was now full and the cattle had gathered in a slow, steady line, I could hear the water moving again, not hidden beneath layers of concrete infiltration systems, but open, purposeful, doing exactly what it had been designed to do decades ago. And behind me, Diane's voice continued, still trying to regain that sense of structure, talking about assessments and next steps and emergency meetings. But even she had to know that none of those things would bring back what was missing, not without addressing the one factor she had ignored from the beginning. And as the sun dipped a little lower, casting longer shadows across the empty basin, the entire scene felt less like a disruption and more like a correction, something that had been out of place finally returning to where it belonged. And the longer it stayed that way, the clearer it became to everyone watching that this was not temporary, not a glitch, not something that would be quietly fixed overnight. It was a boundary, invisible before, now fully revealed, and once you see a boundary like that, you cannot pretend it does not exist anymore. The real collapse did not happen when the last drop of water disappeared. It happened in the hours that followed, when the calls were made and the answers started coming back, slower than Diane expected and far less reassuring than she needed. Because systems like hers move fast when they are enforcing rules, but painfully slow when they are forced to question them. And I watched from a distance as small groups formed and broke apart. Neighbors checking their phones, whispering, comparing what they were hearing, and every new piece of information seemed to strip away another layer of certainty. Because the truth was simple and it did not need interpretation. The water line feeding that structure was legally tied to my property, documented long before their subdivision existed. And more importantly, it was classified as a controlled agricultural resource, not a shared utility, which meant everything they had built around it had no independent right to access it without my consent. And that word consent carries more weight than any bylaw when it is backed by decades of recorded infrastructure. And I could see the shift in Diane when that reality reached her, not all at once, but in stages, first resistance, then disbelief, then that quiet tightening of her expression that comes when someone realizes they have been operating on an assumption that does not hold up, and she tried to push back. Of course she did. Talking about community investment, about shared benefit, about the expectation that unused resources should be developed for the greater good. But even as she spoke, the argument felt thinner, like it was missing something essential, because none of it addressed the core issue, ownership of the system itself. And without that, everything else was just interpretation layered on top of someone else's foundation. And as the afternoon stretched on, the practical consequences started to settle in. Contractors quietly packing up equipment, maintenance crews standing around with nothing to maintain, neighbors leaving one by one. The energy draining from the space the same way the water had, until all that remained was the structure itself and the reality it now represented. And I walked the perimeter one more time, slow and deliberate, taking in the details that had been hidden before, the clean lines of the basin now exposed to sunlight, the faint mineral streaks where water had once rested, the subtle slope that guided everything toward a single point of control. And it all looked different now, not because it had changed, but because its purpose had been revealed. And out in the pasture the trough was full, the surface calm and steady as the cattle moved around it in that quiet, unhurried way that comes from familiarity. And that contrast stayed with me. One system built for appearance now empty and silent, the other built for function continuing without interruption. And when I finally turned back toward the house, I could hear Diane's voice again in the distance, lower now, measured, already shifting into damage control. But it no longer carried the same authority it had before. Because once control is exposed as an illusion, it does not come back the same way. And the land, for the first time since I returned, felt exactly like it used to, steady, balanced, and unmistakably under the control of the system that had always defined it. The next morning came quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after something irreversible has already happened. And when I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of black coffee in my hand, the air carried none of the sharp chemical smell that had lingered for weeks, just the familiar mix of dry grass, dust, and the faint earthy scent of water soaking into soil where it actually belonged. And I stood there for a minute letting that settle, listening to the low steady sounds from the pasture where the trough was already part of the routine again, cattle moving in that slow, unbothered rhythm that never changes no matter what people build around them. And it struck me how quickly something artificial can disappear from a place when it was never truly rooted there to begin with. And down the slope where the pool had been, the structure still sat empty, clean lines catching the early sunlight. But without the water, without the noise, without the crowd, it no longer felt like a centerpiece. It felt like a reminder. And by mid-morning the first trucks started arriving. Not construction crews this time, but inspectors, surveyors, people with clipboards who moved differently, slower, more careful, measuring things that should have been measured from the start. And I watched them from a distance as they traced lines, checked records, compared maps. The quiet process of reality catching up to assumption. And Diane arrived not long after, but she did not walk the same way she had before. No sharp clicks of heels or raised voice directing the scene, just a controlled, measured presence, talking in lower tones, listening more than speaking. And even from where I stood, I could see the difference. Not defeat exactly, but adjustment. The kind that happens when someone realizes the structure they relied on has limits they cannot push past. And by the afternoon, the conversations had shifted completely, no longer about fixing the issue or restoring what was lost, but about liability, about jurisdiction, about who actually had the right to make decisions over that part of the land. And every answer pointed back to the same place, the same foundation that had been there long before any of this started. And I did not need to step in, did not need to argue or present anything, because the records spoke for themselves, the infrastructure spoke for itself, and the land, in its own quiet way, made it clear what it supported and what it did not. And as the sun moved higher and the shadows shortened, I walked down toward the fence line one more time, boots pressing into the dirt that had always felt solid under me. And I looked out over the pasture where the water sat calm and steady, reflecting the sky in a way that felt natural, unforced. And behind me the empty basin held nothing but light and silence. And that contrast was all the conclusion anyone needed. Because this was never about taking something away, it was about restoring what should not have been taken in the first place. And as I turned back toward the house, I could hear my grandfather's voice again, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, reminding Me of something simple that had never changed. That real control does not come from what you build in a hurry. It comes from what you understand deeply and protect patiently. And in the end, nothing about this was loud or chaotic or even surprising. It was just inevitable. Because when something is built on the wrong foundation, it does not matter how polished it looks on the surface, sooner or later. The truth underneath decides what stays and what does not.